I grew up in a small village, the kind of village where nothing really important ever happens. But when something inexplicable does happen, it haunts you for the rest of your life. And I want to share with you something that I've not shared with anyone before. I was just a lad. It was many, many years ago when the girl first appeared in our village. It was around sunset, maybe a little bit later. It was a cold October night. Myself and the rest of the kids, we were playing on the village green, trying to squeeze out 5 more minutes before our parents took us home to bed. And I went over to the girl. I said to her, "Are you new in the village?" She just shook her head. "No." My mother and some of the other parents came over and said to her, "Are you from the next village over? Is your mother nearby?" No. Well, dusk turned to darkness. Our parents took us home to bed. And so a while later, I was watching from my bedroom window, and there she was, still sitting there on the swing, her bare legs dangling above the ground. I wasn't the only one watching her, though. Mrs. Clement from next door, her house borders onto the green. She was watching from the kitchen window. She'd been watching for a while, and it was Mrs. Clement who went out to the little girl to speak to her. She asked her if the little girl had a place to stay. And once again, the little girl shook her head. A couple days later, my mother and some of the other neighbors, I overheard them talking to Mrs. Clement. They asked her, how long is the little girl going to stay with you? And what do the police say? Mrs. Clement said that the girl was fine in staying with her. The police had said it was okay for the time being. They said there were no missing child reports, and there was no report of an accident nearby. Mrs. Clement said, "The little girl, she found her way here. She'll find her way home again. Just give her time." And then Halloween came. As usual, like we did every year, we were over at the Clement house carving pumpkins. Little girl was there too. But as usual, we'd gotten used to her just being quiet, standing at the back of the room, saying nothing. So imagine our surprise when she slid right up through us and thrust her face right up against that gap-toothed grin of the jack-o'-lantern. It was the light. It was the fire. We found that out. We lit a candle and held it in front of her. And she'd stand there looking at it with this funny little grin on her face. And when it was safe, we gave her a candle of her own. Oh, she loved that. And as the nights grew darker and the fire got brighter, the happier she was. That funny little grin. But in the firelight, she was so, so pale. The great Hogmanay bonfire, some said that she was virtually translucent. Mrs. Clement, of course, said that was just silly talk. But even she had to admit that the girl did look pale in the firelight. It was a dreadful winter that year. Oh, I remember that. The rain, drumming against our windows, blocking out what little light leaked out over the horizon. But then, it was an early April morning. It was like the clouds just suddenly all rushed away to the north. The sun rose as if from death, and the great overcoat of gloom was lifted from the villagers' shoulders. They were out again, Us kids could go and play. And the villagers talking in groups of 2s and 3s, sitting on the benches around the green, laughing. And the little girl was no exception. Oh, she was happy. For the first time, we heard her giggle and laugh and run about. And no candle, no fire. Oh, she was happy. Even when us kids stopped for lunch, she just kept on playing, rolling in the grass, doing somersaults. She was so happy. It seemed like she would run faster and jump higher as the day wore on. Mrs. Clement was watching, as she usually did, from the kitchen window while she'd be preparing the tea for that evening. Which is why she was surprised when suddenly the little girl was right at her side, tugging on her skirt. Mrs. Clement looked down to those merry little eyes with that funny little grin. And she reached down and she took the little girl's hand. Later she'd said it was as light as a feather. The little girl indicated that she wanted to go outside. And hand in hand, she and Mrs. Clement went out onto the back porch, and they stood there watching the sun as it sank level with the horizon. And then just as suddenly, the little girl wrenched her hand free from Mrs. Clement and ran to the west side of the house and stopped there at the corner, turned and looked back at Mrs. Clement, giving her that funny little grin. Mrs. Clement didn't see her disappear around the corner. She said the sun dazzled her eyes. Nor did she hear the padding of the little girl's feet on the grass disappear into silence. But when she didn't reemerge, Mrs. Clement ran around the corner, calling out her, looking under the bushes. She ran around the house once, twice. She went inside, searched the kitchen, the bedrooms. All the neighbors promised that they would tell her if we'd caught a glimpse of her. Police said that they would file a missing persons report if the little girl didn't return by morning. And then the cold came back again that night. My mother sent me over to Mrs. Clement to see how she was getting on. I went into the house, and Mrs. Clement was sitting by the fire in the lounge, staring at the fire that she had lit, watching it grow. I sat down quietly beside her. We sat there in silence. And then Mrs. Clement turned and looked at me and said, "Do you hear that, boy? Listen. Listen, boy, do you hear it?" And she was leaning towards the fire, and I leaned forwards as well. And I heard it. The childish laughter coming from the popping and crackling of the flames.